Thank you for being here. What I'm about to share with you is one of the most significant drug busts in recent history, and it happened right at our doorstep. On December 15, 2025, something extraordinary took place at the Otay Mesa port of entry in California. Officers from U.S. Customs and Border Protection made what they're calling one of the largest fentanyl seizures ever recorded at that crossing. They discovered approximately 1,200 pounds of fentanyl hidden inside a commercial produce truck trying to enter the United States from Mexico. Let me tell you why this matters so much. That amount of fentanyl, 1,200 pounds, is enough to kill hundreds of millions of people if distributed in lethal doses. This wasn't just another drug bust. This single truck contained enough deadly poison to potentially wipe out entire cities, to devastate communities across America. The morning started like any other at Otay Mesa, one of the busiest commercial border crossings between the United States and Mexico. This port sits just south of San Diego, California, and handles thousands of commercial vehicles every single day. We're talking about legitimate cargo, produce, manufactured goods, raw materials, all flowing between two countries. The numbers are staggering. Otay Mesa processes approximately 10,000 commercial trucks every day. Think about that. 10,000 tractor trailers rolling through carrying everything America needs from Mexico. On that December morning, a white commercial tractor trailer approached the primary inspection lanes. It looked completely normal. According to CBP's announcement, the truck was manifested as carrying a shipment of cucumbers destined for distribution in the United States. Fresh produce from Mexico. Nothing unusual about that. Mexican agriculture supplies a huge portion of the fresh fruits and vegetables consumed in America, particularly during winter months. But something wasn't right. When the truck arrived at the primary inspection booth, CBP officers conducted their standard screening. They examined the driver's documents, asked questions about the cargo, checked the manifest against their systems. Something during this interaction raised their suspicions. Maybe the driver seemed nervous. Maybe there were inconsistencies in his story. Maybe a database check flagged something. CBP doesn't typically share exactly what triggers these referrals because they don't want to give smugglers a playbook. But whatever it was, the officers made the critical decision to send this truck to secondary inspection. In the secondary inspection area, officers have more time and better tools to thoroughly examine vehicles. They started with what's called non-intrusive inspection technology. This includes X-ray imaging systems that can scan entire trucks and reveal what's inside without physically unloading everything. When officers examined the X-ray images of this produce truck, they immediately saw irregularities. The density patterns didn't match what you'd expect with legitimate produce. There were areas significantly more dense than boxes of cucumbers should be. That's when they knew they had something. Officers made the decision to physically inspect the cargo. They opened the trailer and began examining the boxes of produce. What they discovered was shocking. Hidden among the boxes of cucumbers were numerous packages containing fentanyl. According to CBP's official statement, officers ultimately seized approximately 1,200 pounds of fentanyl from this single vehicle. The drugs were packaged in multiple wrapped bundles concealed within the legitimate produce shipment. The driver, a Mexican national whose identity hasn't been publicly released, was immediately detained and turned over to Homeland Security investigations for questioning and processing. The truck and its contents were seized as evidence. CBP officers at Otay Mesa stated this was one of the largest single fentanyl seizures they had ever made at that port. The street value is difficult to calculate precisely, but estimates range from $20 million to over $100 million, depending on whether it's sold in bulk or broken down into pills for retail sale. To understand what we're dealing with here, you need to know how fentanyl trafficking works at the U.S.-Mexico border. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid manufactured in clandestine laboratories, primarily in Mexico. Mexican drug cartels, particularly the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, have become the dominant manufacturers and traffickers of fentanyl destined for the United States market. These cartels obtain precursor chemicals, mostly from China, that are used to manufacture fentanyl. They operate laboratories in Mexico where they produce fentanyl in powder form or press it into counterfeit pills that look like legitimate prescription medications. Then they need to smuggle this across the border into the United States, where it will be distributed to dealers and eventually to users. Here's what most people don't realize. The vast majority of fentanyl that enters the United States comes through official ports of entry along the southern border. That might seem counterintuitive. You might think smugglers would try to avoid border crossings where there are CBP officers inspecting vehicles. But the reality is that ports of entry process enormous volumes of legitimate trade every single day. Smuggling organizations calculate that they can hide drugs among legitimate cargo and have a reasonable chance of getting through without detection. With 10,000 commercial trucks crossing at Otay, Mesa alone every day, CBP officers face an enormous challenge. They need to facilitate legitimate trade, which is essential for the American economy and for consumers who depend on goods from Mexico. But they also need to intercept illegal drugs, weapons, currency, and other contraband that smugglers are trying to bring across hidden in that legitimate traffic. CBP uses a multi-layered approach. Every vehicle and driver is screened through databases to check for red flags or previous issues. Officers at the primary inspection booth are trained to look for signs of nervousness, inconsistencies in stories, anything unusual about the vehicle or cargo. CBP employs technology including license plate readers, X-ray systems, drug-sniffing dogs, and various other tools to help detect contraband. But despite all these measures, CBP can only conduct detailed secondary inspections on a small percentage of vehicles. If officers tried to thoroughly inspect every truck that crosses the border, trade would come to a complete halt. Officers have to make strategic decisions about which vehicles to refer for secondary inspection based on intelligence, risk assessment, and observations. Smuggling organizations understand this dynamic perfectly. They know if they attempt to smuggle drugs through ports of entry, there's a risk of seizure. But they calculate that if they make enough attempts with enough different vehicles, a significant percentage will make it through successfully. The profit margins on fentanyl are so high that even losing some shipments to interdiction is acceptable as the cost of doing business. Produce trucks are particularly attractive to smugglers for several reasons. First, there's enormous legitimate produce trade between Mexico and the United States, so produce trucks crossing the border are extremely common and don't automatically raise suspicion. Second, produce provides good concealment opportunities. Fresh fruits and vegetables are loaded in boxes and crates that can be manipulated. Smugglers can create false compartments, hide drug packages among the produce, or even hollow out individual pieces to conceal drugs. Third, produce is perishable, which creates time pressure for inspections. If CBP officers spend hours thoroughly inspecting a load of fresh strawberries or cucumbers, that produce may spoil, creating financial losses for legitimate businesses. Smugglers hope this time pressure might discourage thorough inspections. The 200 pounds of fentanyl seized from this produce truck in December represents just one attempt by one smuggling organization. CBP makes similar seizures, though usually smaller in quantity, on a regular basis at ports of entry across the southern border. Let me explain the numbers that help us understand both the significance of this particular seizure and the broader scope of fentanyl trafficking. 200 pounds of fentanyl is an almost incomprehensible quantity when you consider the drug's potency. The Drug Enforcement Administration estimates that just 2 milligrams of fentanyl can be a lethal dose for someone without tolerance to opioids. 2 milligrams is about the size of a few grains of salt. 1 pound equals approximately 450,000 milligrams, so 200 pounds equals approximately 540 million milligrams. If we divide that by 2 milligrams per lethal dose, we get approximately 270 million lethal doses. Obviously, not every dose results in a death. Many people who use fentanyl have built up tolerance and can survive doses that would kill someone without tolerance. Much of the fentanyl is diluted or mixed with other substances before it reaches users, but the potential lethality of this quantity is staggering. This single truck contained enough fentanyl to theoretically kill every person in the United States if the drug was distributed as pure lethal doses. From a financial perspective, calculating the value is complex. If sold in bulk at the wholesale level, 200 pounds of fentanyl might be worth $20 to $30 million. But if it's processed into counterfeit pills and sold at retail prices, the value could exceed $100 million. This seizure at Otay Mesa in December was one of the largest at that particular port, but it's not unprecedented. CBP makes large fentanyl seizures with some regularity at ports of entry across the southern border. According to CBP statistics for fiscal year 2025, which runs from October 1, 2024 through September 30, 2025, the agency seized approximately 23,000 pounds of fentanyl at ports of entry along the southern border. That's 23,000 pounds intercepted, but law enforcement officials estimate that for every shipment they intercept, several others make it through undetected. If we assume conservatively that CBP intercepts 25% of fentanyl smuggling attempts, that would mean approximately 92,000 pounds of fentanyl successfully crossed the border in fiscal year 2025. That's enough fentanyl to cause tens of millions of overdoses. And indeed, fentanyl overdoses remain at historic highs in the United States. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, fentanyl and other synthetic opioids were responsible for approximately 75,000 overdose deaths in 2024. That's 75,000 Americans dead in 1 year from primarily fentanyl, making it the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 and 45. The scale of this crisis is difficult to overstate. We're losing the equivalent of a small city's population every year to fentanyl overdoses. The crisis shows no signs of slowing despite increased law enforcement efforts, public awareness campaigns, and treatment and prevention programs. What does this massive seizure at Otay Mesa tell us? First, this demonstrates that CBP officers at ports of entry are doing difficult and important work. The officers who detected this shipment, who insisted on secondary inspection despite the truck appearing to carry legitimate produce, who used technology and training to identify the concealed drugs, those officers potentially saved thousands of lives by preventing this fentanyl from reaching American communities. But it also highlights how difficult the challenge is. This was one truck among thousands that cross at Otay Mesa every day. CBP intercepted this shipment, but how many others made it through on that same day? The reality is that with the volume of traffic at our ports of entry, it's impossible to thoroughly inspect every vehicle. CBP has to make strategic decisions about where to focus resources, and inevitably some smuggling attempts succeed. Second, this seizure underscores the sophistication of cartel smuggling operations. Concealing 1,200 pounds of fentanyl in a produce truck requires planning, resources, and logistical capability. The cartels are not amateur operations. They're sophisticated criminal enterprises with significant financial resources and organizational capabilities. A shipment of 1,200 pounds of fentanyl doesn't happen by accident. This represents a major operation by one of the Mexican cartels, almost certainly either the Sinaloa cartel or the Jalisco New Generation cartel, the two organizations responsible for manufacturing and trafficking most of the fentanyl that enters the United States. The process would have begun at cartel-operated laboratories in Mexico, where the fentanyl was manufactured. These labs use precursor chemicals to synthesize fentanyl powder. For a shipment this large, we're talking about industrial-scale production. Once the fentanyl was manufactured, it needed to be packaged for smuggling. Cartel operatives would have wrapped the drugs in multiple layers of plastic or other materials to protect them from moisture, to help mask odors, and to facilitate concealment. The next step was acquiring a legitimate produce shipment to use as cover. The cartel would either have corrupted someone in the legitimate produce industry, or they would have created a front company that appears to be in the produce business, but is actually controlled by the cartel. The produce truck would have been loaded with genuine cucumbers at a facility in Mexico. But hidden among those cucumbers were the packages of fentanyl. This loading process would need to be done carefully to ensure that the weight distribution in the trailer appeared normal, and that casual inspection wouldn't immediately reveal the drugs. The cartel then needed a driver willing to take the load across the border. Sometimes cartels use drivers who are knowing participants and are paid for their role in smuggling. Other times they deceive drivers, loading drugs into trucks without the driver's knowledge and having someone retrieve the drugs after the truck crosses the border. In some cases, cartels threaten or coerce drivers, telling them that their families will be harmed if they don't cooperate. Once the truck crossed into the United States successfully, assuming it hadn't been caught at the border like this one was, there would be a plan for offloading the drugs. The truck might be driven to a warehouse or distribution center where the fentanyl would be removed from among the produce. From that initial distribution point, the 200 pounds of fentanyl would be broken down into smaller quantities and distributed to regional traffickers. Those traffickers would further break it down and distribute it to local dealers. Eventually, it would reach the street level where it would be sold to users. For the cartels, a shipment of this size represents a major financial investment and a major potential profit. The cost to manufacture 200 pounds of fentanyl is relatively low, probably in the range of hundreds of thousands of dollars for the precursor chemicals and the manufacturing costs. But the street value, depending on how it's ultimately sold, could be anywhere from $20 million to over $100 million. Of course, there are costs and risks involved. The cartels have to pay bribes and operational costs in Mexico. They have to pay drivers and logistics coordinators. They have to pay distribution networks in the United States. They have to accept that some percentage of shipments will be intercepted by law enforcement, representing total losses. But even with all these costs and risks, the profit margins on fentanyl are enormous, which is why cartels continue to produce and traffic it in massive quantities, despite the dangers and the law enforcement efforts to stop them. The cartels study CBP's inspection methods and adapt their smuggling techniques accordingly. They test different concealment methods to see what works. They gather intelligence about which ports of entry have the most thorough inspections and which might have vulnerabilities. This is an ongoing cat-and-mouse game between law enforcement and criminal organizations. This case highlights the need for enhanced border security measures. CBP needs more officers, more advanced detection technology, better intelligence capabilities, and stronger consequences for those caught smuggling to deter these attempts. There's been ongoing debate about border security funding and priorities, but cases like this demonstrate why robust border enforcement is essential. Every pound of fentanyl that CBP intercepts at the border is a pound that won't reach American streets, that won't be pressed into counterfeit pills, that won't contribute to overdose deaths in our communities. Finally, this seizure reminds us that the fentanyl crisis cannot be solved by law enforcement alone. Yes, we need strong border security and aggressive enforcement against traffickers, but we also need to address the demand side. Why are so many Americans using drugs in the first place? What can we do to prevent addiction, to provide effective treatment to help people recover? The driver of the produce truck seized at Otay, Mesa is currently in federal custody facing drug trafficking charges. Given the quantity of drugs involved, he could be facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years and possibly up to life in federal prison if convicted. Homeland Security Investigations continues to investigate who organized this smuggling attempt and where the drugs were ultimately destined. The 200 pounds of fentanyl seized in this operation will be destroyed. Those drugs will never reach American users, will never be pressed into counterfeit pills, will never cause overdoses. This represents lives saved and families protected from tragedy. But the broader fight against fentanyl trafficking continues. Mexican cartels continue to manufacture fentanyl in massive quantities. They continue to attempt to smuggle it across our border using every method they can devise. Americans continue to die from fentanyl overdoses at devastating rates. CBP officers at ports of entry across the southern border are on the front lines of this fight. Every day they screen thousands of vehicles and millions of people crossing into the United States. They use technology, training, intelligence, and instinct to try to intercept the drugs that cartels are attempting to smuggle. Seizures like this one at Otay, Mesa demonstrate their capability and dedication. But they need support. They need adequate staffing so they're not overwhelmed by the volume of traffic they must process. They need advanced technology to help detect concealed contraband. They need strong backing from prosecutors who will aggressively charge and convict those caught smuggling. They need a comprehensive national strategy that addresses both the supply of drugs coming across the border and the demand for drugs within our communities. For all of us, the message is clear. Fentanyl is killing Americans at unprecedented rates, and much of that fentanyl is being smuggled across our southern border, hidden in vehicles like this produced truck. Border security is not just an immigration issue or a political issue, it's a public health crisis and a public safety imperative. The officers at Otay Mesa who made this seizure in December did outstanding work. They potentially saved thousands of lives, but there will be another truck, another smuggling attempt, another test of our border security tomorrow and every day after. This is an ongoing fight that requires sustained attention and resources. The 200 pounds seized represents both a victory and a stark reminder. A victory because these drugs were stopped. A reminder because it shows the scale of what we're up against. When a single truck can carry enough poison to kill 270 million people, when cartels are willing to risk $100 million shipments, when 75,000 Americans die every year from these drugs, we cannot afford to look away. This seizure at Otay Mesa matters. It saved lives. But it's one battle in a much larger war. And that war is being fought every single day at our borders, in our communities, and in the lives of families devastated by addiction and loss.